I used to be a cop and I've helped execute a few search warrants. If someone's trying to store Bitcoin in such a way that's either resistant to theft or resistant to seizure by some sort of government entity, Multisig is this huge asymmetrical tool that puts the power in the hands of the defender as opposed to the person who's trying to get custody of Bitcoin. And I think a lot of these hardware wallet manufacturers are going to continue to think about ways that we can accentuate the separation between the device that talks to your private keys and the other device that coordinates with the network to show you a balance and broadcast transactions and stuff like that. To laugh at myself a little bit, I'm a cheapskate and I wanted to get into multisig, and the concept of buying 5 Trezors or 3 Coldcards and 2 Bitboxes or whatever mix of hardware wallets you want to have, you're going to spend $300, $400, $500, maybe even up to $1,000 buying multiple hardware wallets. The simplicity and cost efficiency of managing those keys with just one device was appealing to me. The most important thing is what helps you sleep at night. And it also is helpful to me to think of security as a journey rather than a destination.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week we have SeedSigner. SeedSigner, how's it going?
It's going great. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to have you. For the audience who may not know what SeedSigner is, can you briefly explain like an overview of it?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. SeedSigner is a cold storage tool that has the same functionality as what people understand comes with a conventional hardware wallet, but it's something you can build yourself from off-the-shelf, commonly available electronic components. I think that's probably the best way to distill it.
Yeah, I like that. Can you maybe explain like why, and we're definitely going to I want to dive deep into like what SeedSigner is and the specific parts about it, but why build this product?
That's a big question. So I have a background in digital forensics. I've talked about it before. I was a police officer for 15 years, and for 12 of those years, I worked in a computer lab, taking apart cell phones and computers and mirroring data from hard drives and thumb drives and trying to see if they were relevant to investigations. And part of what I did at the forensic lab involved trying to access data on mobile phones that had passcodes or some of the usual access restriction mechanisms that are in place on cell phones. And so I started when mobile phones were these awkward flip things that you had to open up and press the 8 button 4 times to get a lowercase t or whatever it was. And I watched them grow up into the supercomputers that they are that we carry around in our pockets. And as a part of that growth, I watched the cat and mouse game that is mobile phone security grow up because initially enterprise and the U.S. government wouldn't touch the iPhone and wouldn't touch Android phones because they didn't have the security protections that the BlackBerry, which preceded it, had. And so Apple and Samsung and some of the other Android manufacturers had to up their game. And there became this cat and mouse game between the manufacturers and then the private companies that are contracted by the U.S. government to try to access data on phones. And the iPhone would implement a certain new security feature, and it would take the private companies maybe 6 months to get around that security feature. And so Apple would implement something new to take a step backwards. So I just had this natural kind of skepticism towards secure hardware as it being a little bit of a cat and mouse game. There's definitely some value to it, but for my long-term Bitcoin savings, it was just something that I was skeptical of. I was also skeptical of any hardware wallets, and not all of them require it these days, but any hardware wallet that required you to connect it via USB cable, because you understand that if you can update the firmware via that USB cable, you could be tricked into doing something you don't mean to do, and bad things can happen. So I wasn't a fan of USB connected hardware wallets, which are less of a thing now. But I myself personally was just looking for a new approach to cold storage that maybe I could leverage some of the things that I learned or experienced when I was working in, as a digital forensics practitioner. And I kind of stumbled into it with Spectre Desktop, and Spectre Desktop has a companion project called the Spectre DIY, which was a do-it-yourself signing device / hardware wallet that preceded ours. So we definitely weren't the first to the party. But finding the Spectre DIY, experiencing Multisig, and learning more about that, experiencing this air-gapped transaction signing workflow that uses QR codes, those were both ingredients that led me to this approach that we've maybe not pioneered, but done a lot to prove out in the Bitcoin community.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into SeedSigner and hardware wallets, Bitcoin hardware wallets in general. But you brought up an interesting point about the iPhones and Android and BlackBerry. So would you say holding a key on an iPhone, you should just assume that it's able to be compromised to some extent?
Yeah, that's even if it's held in a more secure way on the phone, we still would think of that. I think most people would think of that as a hot wallet. The true way to store your private keys for the long term is to have it never touch a device that interacts with the internet, and have it only interact with devices that are offline. So yeah, I'd say anything on a phone is definitely a hot wallet.
Yep, agreed. So building a SeedSigner or trying to do that, can you kind of explain the process and what's the hardest part about doing that yourself?
The hardest part about doing it yourself, it's a pretty simple process, but understandably, a lot of people who don't tinker with DIY electronics or anything like that could be intimidated by it. Probably the hardest part is there's three basic ingredients that go into the SeedSigner. There's a Raspberry Pi single board computer. There's a specific display and controls hat, and a hat is just a fancy word for another circuit board that sits on top of the Raspberry Pi. So you have the Raspberry Pi, this display and control module, and then a simple camera that's compatible with the Raspberry Pi. But if you get a Raspberry Pi that does not have the GPIO pins, which are those set of 40 pins that stick up off the board that allow it to interface with other things, in our case, the screen and controls, if those aren't soldered on, I would say that's probably the most daunting thing for people. Soldering is definitely an ask for people who aren't used to building their own hardware. There are ways around that. You can most everybody has a mobile phone repair shop in their neighborhood, and you can just take the Raspberry Pi and the pins to the mobile phone shop and ask them to attach it. And it's something they should be able to do, in less than 10 minutes and super inexpensively. But beyond that, after you have the GPIO pins, it's really just placing the screen and controls on top of the pins, attaching a ribbon cable for a camera, and you have the basic ingredients for a SeedSigner. You just need to download the software and write it to a memory card and put the memory card in the Raspberry Pi, and it's yeah.
So I kind of know the answer to this, but the audience may not know exactly. It's called a SeedSigner, which is kind of different from a hardware wallet. Why call it a SeedSigner or a signing device versus a hardware wallet?
The term SeedSigner is actually, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the original device wasn't actually intended to sign transactions. It was just intended to create private keys. I'd gotten the idea from a guy called Michael Flaxman, who you probably know. I think has some interface with Unchained, but he wrote this 10x Bitcoin security guide, which is still a great document for people looking to improve their personal private key security posture. But I was DMing with him a little bit, and he had this idea to use a very specific version of the Raspberry Pi, this 01.3, which is a smaller form factor and doesn't have any Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or other sorts of wireless connectivity, to use that to be able to enter the first, say, 23 words of a seed phrase into. And this device would calculate the last word. For those who don't know, it acts as a kind of a checksum against the previous words, such that if you're entering a seed phrase into a hardware wallet and you misread one of the words or mistype one of the words, that last word will provide an indication of the device that something isn't right, and it'll warn you to go back and check because there's some sort of error. So that last word is deterministic. And his idea was to use this little offline computer as a secure environment where you could calculate that last word. So that last word is a type of checksum for the seed, or it could also be caught thought of rather as a signature. And so the original idea for the device was that it was a seed signer. So it would provide that checksum for the last word of the seed phrase. But I kind of took his idea for that and boned up on Python and coded a very clumsy proof of concept for it. And then it dawned on me that if I added a $3 camera to this setup, we'd be able to potentially replicate the entire functionality of the Spectre DIY in terms of being able to not just create keys, but then set up wallets and actually sign transactions. So and as luck would have it, the term seed signer is still, very much applied to all of that functionality as well. So it was kind of a happy accident.
Very cool. So I guess can you elaborate on your concerns of generating seeds in different ways?
Right. So it is my position that when you set up a new Bitcoin wallet, multisig wallet or singlesig or whatever, you should be providing the device you're using with a seed, which is just a human readable version of your private key. You shouldn't let the device provide you with a private key or seed words. And the reason for that is it's just a simple way of mitigating an attack that is, I don't know if I'd say it's remote. It's a possible attack whereby the idea is that if you let the device provide you with a seed, someone could potentially have engineered that device to provide you with a seed phrase that is either already known to the attacker or that is weakened and more easily guessable. And so to avoid that kind of attack, the practice is really to create your own seed phrase. And the best way, in my opinion, to do that is just from the randomness of the physical world around you. So you can do it with dice rolls. There are all sorts of PDFs online with the full list of the 2048 BIP39 seed words, and you can cut those out and do kind of a seed word lottery where you pick out the words at random and then use a tool like SeedSigner. Most of the other hardware wallets do it too, to calculate the last word that I mentioned was deterministic. But that's my opinion, is that you shouldn't let the device provide you with a seed phrase. You should provide it with the seed phrase so that moving forward, you don't have any concerns that seed could be known or guessable to someone else.
Where do you draw the line on paranoia? Because I remember over the years, when I first learned about Bitcoin, I was like, oh dang, I need to buy a hardware wallet. And then I was like, oh, now I need to upgrade a multisig. And then I'm like, oh dang, now I might need to roll the dice and generate my seed from true randomness. To some extent, I feel like you could go on forever. You could be like, oh well, in this case, this could have happened, and therefore I need to do something else. And you could be, spending a year generating your seed phrase or even the addresses from your seed phrase if you don't want to interact with the computer or something. So how do you draw a line of okay, this is too far for what I'm trying to do, and this one solution is probably 99.9999% secure, and I should just be okay with it?
The way I think about it is the most important thing is what helps you sleep at night. And it also is helpful to me to think of security as a journey rather than a destination, because just like technology is changing, the tools that are available to people in their Bitcoin tool set are constantly evolving and growing. So I would not create a Bitcoin wallet with the presumption that this is going to be your forever wallet for the next 10 or 20 years. It may end up being that, but you may end up having these nagging feelings as the Bitcoin price continues to appreciate, God willing if it does, that the things that made sense when your Bitcoin was worth X may not make total sense if your Bitcoin is worth Y. So it's something that people continually kind of reevaluate, and it's something that is because I had what would be considered when I first set up my first cold storage in 2014 would have been considered a pretty solid setup. I used an offline computer. I generated private keys from real world entropy. They never touched the internet. And this was, it was probably before even Trezor was a thing. And Trezor was the first widely available hardware wallet. But over time, as the value of the Bitcoin grew, I started to think about, is there a better way? Could I be doing more? What other people also have to consider, my opinion, is you have the more likely attacks, and I use the word attack, but the more likely ways to lose Bitcoin And then you have these much less likely but high impact ways to lose Bitcoin. So the most likely way that I think people are going to lose Bitcoin is just by misunderstanding their setup, not understanding what information that they need to critically safeguard, or accidentally losing it somehow. And we saw that a lot in early Bitcoin with people, discarding private keys, or throwing away hard drives, not realizing that they had private keys on them. So doing Bitcoin security and storing Bitcoin, it's not a hugely complex thing, but there are some pieces of information that are absolutely critical for you to safeguard and ensure that you can continue the access to Bitcoin. We also do have to consider, as the value of Bitcoin grows, like personal security and personal safety as an element of the mix. And that is not just, being ready for the person who knocks on your door with a $5 wrench, but that's also being careful about your identity and who you talk to about Bitcoin, and definitely not telling anyone, what you've invested in Bitcoin or how much you hold. Those are definitely things to consider, but I would also argue that the hardware wallet industry tends to zoom in on these sort of exotic attacks, like an evil maid that's waiting for you to walk away from your bedroom so that she can install some sort of malicious software on your hardware wallet, or the person with the $5 wrench that's going to knock on your back door, at 2 a.m, or other exotic attacks. While these things are possible and they should be somewhere in your threat model, the biggest concern is just not rugging yourself. Hopefully that answers your question. I probably rambled on for a bit there.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. I definitely agree that most people have probably lost Bitcoin not because it was stolen, but because they got too complicated and didn't fully understand what they were doing, and just overcomplicated and lost their Bitcoin. But yeah, it's crazy to think about. You said you've been, thinking about Bitcoin custody since 2014, which is obviously now 10 years ago. How has Bitcoin custody evolved since 2014, and did it evolve like as you expected it to, or did it not evolve as you expected it to, and that's why like you're helping build this SeedSigner concept?
I don't know what I expected, but I do think of Bitcoin security as evolving in certain kind of phases, or epochs is the term I use to describe them sometimes. The first phase was this file called a wallet.dat that existed in Bitcoin Core, still exists in Bitcoin Core if you're holding Bitcoin in a hot wallet on your computer. And there were some ways that you could encrypt that or try to prevent access to it, and definitely back it up offline. But really, most people interface with the Bitcoin network through Bitcoin Core, and that wallet.dat field was the original security mechanism to safeguard your Bitcoin. Tons of credit to Slush and the other people at Trezor. They came up with this idea of a separate computing device whose whole purpose was to interact with your private keys, and also, in the case of a Trezor, to store your private key. So that to me represented kind of the next big leap in cold storage, was having a dedicated device that was locked down in terms of the hardware that was present on the device and the software that was loaded onto it, and having those kind of access control restrictions. That was a huge advance, and it was such a significant improvement that, of course, we saw all of these other hardware wallet companies and a whole industry spring up around the concept of helping people secure their Bitcoin. I would consider Coldcard, if we think of Trezor as like the second epoch of Bitcoin cold storage, I would consider Coldcard like 2.5, because what they did with later versions of the Coldcard, I'm not versed in their entire history, but at some point you could use a micro SD to move signatures from the Coldcard to an online computer where they're then broadcast to the network. And Trezor and everything that kind of followed it used that USB connection that I talked about making me so nervous. Using a micro SD card to move the information from the device that interacts with your private keys to the device that interacts with the larger Bitcoin network, I think that was another significant jump forward. But if there's an epoch 3 of cold storage, I think it's a few things coming into play. It's multisig solutions being much more accessible to users. I personally think it's this air-gapped QR code exchange that is even more constrained than the micro SD. With a USB cable, you can move a ton of information very quickly, and it's really difficult to audit. You don't really know what's happening unless you're somehow tapping into that line, which is, that's something that most people can do. With the micro SD, you can still move a significant amount of information, but you have a lot more control over which device is accessing data from which device at one time. And whatever's on that micro SD card is also auditable. But using QR codes to let two devices communicate with one another really constrains the communication medium between them, such that it significantly raises the bar as trying to introduce some sort of malicious software to an offline system or trying to communicate something else malicious. So in this new sort of evolution of Bitcoin cold storage, I think air-gapped QR code exchange, or maybe there's going to be some other way to constrain that communication protocol between the devices, is important. And I think a lot of these hardware wallet manufacturers are going to continue to think about ways that we can accentuate the separation between the device that talks to your private keys and the other device that coordinates with the network to show you a balance in broadcast transactions and stuff like that. I also personally think that statelessness has a big part to play in practical terms in cold storage, and that's something that I haven't really talked about thus far. So statelessness is just a fancy computer science term for devices that either don't remember anything or are specifically engineered to not remember certain pieces of information. This is another kind of item that was in my tool belt at the forensic lab. And we used to use statelessness as people understand it with a tool like Tails OS. So you can boot a computer to an alternate operating system and access the hard drive within the computer. Technically, you can get online usually, like Tails is specifically engineered by default not to let you online, but you can optionally get online. But the whole point is that when you power that computer off, that alternate operating system that you were using was entirely in memory. And the nature of computer RAM is such that when you remove power from it, it resets back to a kind of default natural data state. And so it's such that you weren't really there. There's not a trace of things that you did or you're having used that computer. And I thought this was really compelling for cold storage in that it makes the device less of an attack vector, because if someone has a stateless signing device, meaning that it doesn't store private keys, it doesn't keep a record of transactions that are made or wallets that are set up or anything like that, someone stealing that device doesn't mean that they have access to your private keys. So it eliminates an attack vector there, but it opens up the possibility such that if it doesn't remember your keys, it opens up the possibility of using that one device to manage multiple private keys. So you could either set up multiple wallets using the same device, or in the context of a multi-sig setup, you can use that same device to manage one or more or all of the keys in a given setup, depending on your goal for the security of that particular wallet. And we were not the first to pioneer this concept of statelessness. It was something that existed in Spectre DIY and probably other tools before that as well. But we were the first to, I think, embrace that and make it a core part of the security model. I remember seeing a tweet from one of the creators of Spectre DIY, and they said that because it didn't have a secure element.
In this frontier moment, SeedSigner mentioned the term secure element. A Bitcoin hardware wallet is a lot like a fortified castle. The secure element within this hardware wallet is the most secure inner chamber of this castle, known as the keep. In medieval times, the keep was the last line of defense, designed to be impenetrable with thick walls and extremely limited access only through a series of moats and drawbridges. Even if someone could breach the outer defenses of the castle, which would be the hardware wallet itself, getting into the keep, the secure element, and accessing the treasure, which would be the private keys, would be extremely challenging without the proper authorization. And now back to SeedSigner.
It was maybe something that shouldn't be taken as seriously as something to store private keys. not realizing that statelessness was really such an innovative part of what they were doing with it. So that was something that, by virtue of my forensic background, I really saw the value of. And to laugh at myself a little bit, I'm a cheapskate, and I wanted to get into multisig, and the concept of buying 5 Trezors or 3 Coldcards and 2 Bitboxes or whatever mix of hardware wallets you wanted to have. You're going to spend $300, $400, $500, maybe even up to $1,000 buying multiple hardware wallets. And the simplicity and cost efficiency of managing those keys with just one device was appealing to me, and it's something that I think has been shown to be compelling to other people too.
Yeah, it's very cool. When it comes to buying the parts for a SeedSigner or just buying an actual hardware wallet as well, like what challenges do people face when trying to buy this hardware for either, for both, and making sure that hardware hasn't been tampered with beforehand or doesn't have like some sort of backdoor?
It's a difficult problem. It's a difficult problem. We've all seen these kind of CIA setups where they have repackaging stations and they have all sorts of foil seals and shrink wrapping and things that they can use to mimic traditional manufacturing processes. The first thing that a lot of people don't do, most people, when they want to buy a hardware wallet, they go to the manufacturer's website. There's usually a button in the upper right-hand corner that says store. They click on the store, they pick out what they like, and then they start entering personal information into the website. Usually, a lot of people use their real name. They have it shipped to their home. They have to provide payment card information, and they usually provide an email address so that they can follow up about the order. And it's just a regular part of the online checkout flow that all of us are so familiar with. And there are multiple problems with this. The first is your home address. So if Bitcoin appreciates and you're known to be a Bitcoiner that even in 2024 was purchasing a hardware wallet, some may presume that you're holding a substantial amount of Bitcoin and may come and knock on your door at some point. So it's one consideration is definitely some security consciousness around other people knowing where you live. Another factor of this is that email address, which unfortunately a lot of the manufacturers are going to hold on to. And some of them are even going to give your email address to a third-party marketing firm who specializes in email marketing. And they're going to periodically email you to tell you about new products and services that are available from the hardware wallet company. In my perception, the biggest challenge of that is now this normalizes the idea of you receiving emails from the manufacturer of your hardware wallet. And it may be benign that they're just trying to tell you about bug fixes or an update or something like that. But the very fact of those emails appearing in your inbox means that someone else wishing to impersonate your hardware wallet manufacturer has a much lower bar to trick you into clicking on a link or doing something really stupid like entering your recovery words into a browser window or something. My personal opinion is that people should be in the habit of going to the manufacturer's website and checking on things like updates and bug fixes and stuff instead of normalizing this process of those companies emailing you, which is often more about them marketing to get you to buy additional things than it is actually telling you about critical updates or anything like that. So some people are able to sidestep those issues by providing a false name, using a post office box or some other third-party shipping receipt solution. And I have this ability to digress. I think I've gone beyond your original question, but those are some of the challenges I see in acquiring the hardware device. And then there's the issue of authentic hardware. Unfortunately, if you receive a malicious counterfeit device, that device is going to be able to lie to you in certain ways in the documentation and in the interface to try to convince you that it is in fact not a malicious device. So it's a tough problem. And with SeedSigner, we try to sidestep this problem by building our signer from parts that are not readily associated with Bitcoin or readily recognizable as Bitcoin-related things. So Raspberry Pi is something that is used for all sorts of kids use them for school projects, or people use them for hobbyist electronics and home automation, 3D printing, all this kind of stuff. So there's tons of uses for Raspberry Pis that exist beyond being a SeedSigner. And the reality is that the percentage of Raspberry Pis in the global supply that are used for SeedSigners is minuscule. It's like a percent of a percent kind of a thing. So there's much less of an incentive to attack that supply chain, because it would be much more fruitful to try to attack a device that is known to be, hardware wallet. So that's one of the ways that we address this real, what is a legitimate challenge with supply chain issues and acquiring hardware that hasn't been tampered with or otherwise compromised.
What would be your reply to someone that suggests that using a general purpose computer like a Raspberry Pi is unsafe for key signing?
I believe my first response would be to ask them to describe the specific attack, because there are some aspects with SeedSigner that are baked into the whole model that I think mitigate any sort of risks of using general purpose hardware. And the first and foremost of those is the air gapping. So the device, whether or not there could be some sort of vulnerability in Raspberry Pi that could be used to exploit its use as a SeedSigner, if you purchase a Raspberry Pi Zero version 1.3, it physically does not have the hardware on board to be able to communicate with the outside world wirelessly. You can also take various models that do have that ability and provably disable that hardware so that it neuters the device in terms of its online capability. So I would argue that the guarantees around the air-gapped operation of the device, and then the generally accepted principle of the volatility of memory, which is what we leverage, the operating system that we release with SeedSigner software operates entirely in memory. After you boot up the device, once you see the user interface, before you create any private keys or import a private key, you can remove the memory card, so you can have some elevated assurance that private key information could be somehow leaking onto that memory card. But the air gapping and the assurances around the volatility in RAM, I would say, provide us a unique positioning such that even if there were issues with the Raspberry Pi platform, it dramatically limits the type of attacks that could be executed and makes those attacks a lot harder to do. It goes back to talking about considering your Bitcoin hardware, your Bitcoin cold storage setup. You're much more likely to rug yourself because you don't understand what your hardware wallet's doing than you are to fall victim to some kind of Easter egg secret firmware that is being loaded by someone without your knowledge.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you think about multisig versus singlesig for long-term Bitcoin savings?
One of the things that I think about in terms of multisig is what is the amount of information that people are responsible for safeguarding, and how many hiding places do they need? Because that was the light bulb moment for me with multisig, was the power of it. So I mentioned I used to be a cop, and I've helped execute a few search warrants, and I've gone into people's homes and had to look for things. And if someone's trying to store Bitcoin in such a way that's either resistant to theft or resistant to seizure by some sort of government entity, multisig is this huge asymmetrical tool that puts the power in the hands of the defender as opposed to the person who's trying to get custody of Bitcoin. So you may have to find something in that person's house, but you may also have to find something in a safe deposit box at a bank down the street, or in their best friend's gun safe, or on another continent with someone else that is helping them secure that Bitcoin that you're trying to get a hold of. So that power also creates this additional responsibility that users have to contend with in terms of how many secrets do I have to hide, and how many different hiding places do I need for these secrets. If you use a conventional hardware wallet, as a lot of people listening to this will have had the experience of doing, when you first onboard with that wallet, you're setting it up in your home. Usually, if the first thing, if not one of the very first few things they have you do, is take out this paper card that's been supplied with the hardware wallet, write down these 12 words or write down these 24 words and put them in a safe place and don't lose them, which is entirely reasonable, because what is active on that hardware wallet is a digital copy of your private key. It's the same information that's represented by those seed words. And digital devices, unfortunately, can fail suddenly and irreversibly such that we can't get back what was on them. So it's important to have some sort of analog backup.
This episode is sponsored by Sound Advisory, an Unchained affiliate. If you can't talk about your Bitcoin wealth with your financial advisor, it might be time to find a new advisor. Sound Advisory is a leading financial advisory firm for long-term Bitcoin holders like yourself. If you need help optimizing taxes, establishing goals, creating a distribution plan for Bitcoin wealth, or designing estate and inheritance plans, then check out Sound Advisory at thesoundadvisory.com for more information. That's thesoundadvisory.com. Now back to the show.
Of what's on your hardware wallet, that core secret. But now you have this issue of you have the core secret, and if you understand what it is, you understand that it is an unprotected version of what's in the hardware wallet. So now what do you do with this written down secret? A lot of people store it, at the bottom of the box that the hardware wallet came in, or next to their hardware wallet in a safe at home. That's really obviously not the best way to do it, because you have what the hardware wallet is protecting stored right next to it in an unprotected form. You could also take that backup phrase. It's a better idea to take it to hide it in a different part of the house, or put it in a safe deposit box in some sort of tamper evident case. But when you get into multisig, this problem sort of grows, because if you have 3 hardware wallets and a simple 2 of 3 setup, you now have arguably 6 things you have to hide, because you have each hardware wallet and you have the backup. And we're back to this issue of it doesn't make sense to hide the backup with the hardware wallet. So you have to find all these hiding places. So my contention is, for the long-term Bitcoin savings, this is the generational money that you're probably going to pass down to your kids. You might use to buy a house in 10 years. You might use to fund your kids' college education in 15 years, something that you're making maybe regular deposits to, but you're not making a lot of spends from. Why not let those analog copies of your private keys that are either written down on paper, or even better yet, stamped into metal or some other durable material, why not let those analog copies of your private keys be the only copies that you have to worry about safeguarding? Now, it's going to be a little bit more of a pain. There's going to be some friction. When you do want to make a spend, you're going to have to go to physical different locations and retrieve those private keys and enter them into a device that can generate the signatures that you need to spend the money. But again, my long-term savings, I might do a key check once a year, but it's been 3 or 4 years since I've made any sort of outgoing significant spend with that wallet. I'm usually consolidating UTXOs, or I'm just assuaging my own, giving myself reassurances that I still have the keys and I can still access the money and everything is still working the way that I expect it to, because I'm a paranoid human being who worries about things sometimes. But I haven't made these huge spends, so I really don't visit those places where I have keys stored more than once a year. So in those cases, for your long-term savings, why not make those primary copies, those backup copies, those analog copies, the only copy of each given key that you need to worry about? For other Bitcoin use cases, when you're using it to buy things, you're using it to pay people, maybe you're using it in the context of a business and you're settling invoices, and you need to make more frequent transactions, that second copy of your private key that exists on a hardware device that has some access control restrictions in place to keep it safe, such that you don't have to be worried about it keeping it around your house or even in your desk drawer or something like that. That is absolutely reasonable. A lot of people accuse me of fudding secure elements or saying hardware wallets have no use case. It's not that they have no use case at all. It's just that we should think carefully about the Bitcoin cold storage on-chain use case that we need, and then pick the tools that maybe work the best at that. But I think I answered your question somewhere in there.
Yeah. What do you think also about comparing like do-it-yourself multisig versus collaborative custody multisig? Is there room for both? Is there, reasons to pick one or the other? How do you think about those two?
There's 110% room for both, and that's not just because I'm talking to you. A lot of people, we want to get everybody into UTXOs and everybody off of exchanges that we can. And some people are busy. Some people don't have a high technical aptitude. Some people are just anxious about the whole process. But there is a ton of value in, one, having someone who is kind of a hand holder throughout the process that can teach you the things that you need to know and give you the reassurances at the moments that you need them around what you're doing. And then two, they don't always have to be paired, but two, it makes sense for that person also sometimes to hold one of your keys so that if you happen to lose something or you experience a fire or some sort of, other unanticipated emergency, that person can be your recovery agent and say, I can stand in for one of the pieces of information that you've lost. So I am absolutely a big believer in not just, companies like Unchained, but also the Uncle Jim model of trusted Bitcoiners, usually that people either know via family or friend connections, or maybe through their local Bitcoin meetup, who can give them that kind of hand-holding experience to do what they need to do to take custody of their keys, because that's a core part of the mission with SeedSigner, and I think it's a core part of the Bitcoin ethos.
Is there any room also for when you're building a multisig to potentially use different hardware components? Like maybe one is the SeedSigner, that's how you interact with one seed phrase, and then another one is a Trezor? Or would you say, from your perspective, obviously that SeedSigner is probably the best way that you should interact with all of your individual keys?
It's trade-offs. I would say if you have the expertise and you want the absolute paramount sort of secure setup where you've distributed risk across different hardware and software profiles, definitely have a Coldcard and a Foundation Passport and, God forbid, a Ledger or a Trezor, and mix a SeedSigner in that, because you have all of these different hardware and software profiles that if there is some sort of vulnerability that's discovered in one of them, it doesn't affect, your money being lost or stolen or anything like that. Now, it's always trade-offs in security, and it's one of these with great power comes great responsibility kind of things. If you have that paramount setup that incorporates 5 different hardware profiles, you're also going to have to learn 5 different user interfaces, and you're going to have to deal with 5 different sets of potential updates if there are bug fixes that you want access to, or there's some sort of vulnerabilities that can be fixed by update or that kind of stuff. So it is going to increase the complexity of your setup. And that's why I think what we're doing with SeedSigner is really resonating with people in terms of you just have this one device that you have to be familiar with its user interface, that if you want to apply updates, you can, but you don't have to. And you just have that one electronic device and then the individual private keys to worry about. And I'd argue that we're starting to see the hardware wallet companies tune into this sort of workflow around long-term cold storage with just analog copies of the private keys catching on. Blockstream Jade has already incorporated a lot of, if not most of our features into kind of an alternating operation mode that they have, where you can power on the Jade and select a user environment that is stateless such that you can import private keys and sign transactions with an air-gapped workflow. And then when you power the device off, it too is stateless and the keys are not stored on the device. It's my understanding that the Q1 also makes this possible, meaning that you can scan a QR code that represents your seed phrase, or you can type your seed phrase into it and then use that as what they're calling a quote temporary seed. And presumably then when you power off the device, it's no longer stored on there, which again opens up the possibility of using that one device to manage multiple private keys. As I understand, Foundation Passport is also working on an alternate sort of operating mode where you can use that one device in a stateless way to manage multiple private keys. The different wallet companies, there has to be a way to conveniently import the private keys in analog format. And really the seed QR that one of our contributors, Keith McKay, pioneered is really the most convenient way to do that. You can type the words in. It's a little cumbersome. There's some friction associated with it, but that's a viable way to do it too. But even if SeedSigner were to fall by the wayside tomorrow, I would be happy that we kind of forced some of these wallet manufacturers into creating a way to use them to manage a multisig such that you don't have to spend $1,000 on all these hardware wallets to get the security of multisig, in your arsenal. So yeah.
Where do you think the future of Bitcoin custody is in 10 to 20 years? Like, how do you think it might be different from today?
I think the difference is, I think it's going to be less different than a lot of people anticipate, because as we progress through these various improvements in security, not that we're getting close to perfect or, the ideal, but there is a lot of hardware that's being deployed, and there's a lot of people setting up cold storage wallets that aren't going to be as long as they're comfortable with what they've set up, they're not going to be super incentivized to revisit it.
In this frontier moment, SeedSigner is talking about how there are many people using hardware wallets to secure and hold Bitcoin. For a fun thought experiment, let's use AI to estimate how many hardware wallets have been sold since the industry started. From there, we can back into an estimate of the current level of global Bitcoin adoption. Using some basic assumptions, ChatGPT-4 estimated that as of 2023, 22.5 million total hardware wallets have been manufactured and sold. While this is certainly not a perfect measurement, assuming one hardware wallet per person, this would be 0.28% of the world population. Now, many people have probably bought multiple hardware wallets, and some are storing Bitcoin in self-custody using general purpose hardware like a SeedSigner. But this still shows how early it is to Bitcoin. 94% of all Bitcoin have already been mined, yet maybe 0.28% of the world likely has taken some form of self-custody. You're likely very early to Bitcoin. And now back to SeedSigner.
An upgrade to something new. I think there's going to be a lot of Lindy effect with hardware wallets, just because people are putting things into steel and they're spreading, different secrets out in different hiding places. So there's just a lot of friction with upgrades. So I think it's going to happen more slowly than we realize. But I think that on the horizon, I am paying attention to what some of the projects and companies like Liana and Anchorwatch are doing in terms of time locks, whether those be related to a certain Bitcoin block in the future or other ways of creating locks on funds. But it's yet another tool that can help people not rug themselves, such that these it's not a great way to refer them, but they sometimes call them degrading multisigs. And it's such that, let's say you have a 3 of 5, and there's a chance that you could lose one or more of the keys. So in 10 years, that 3 of 5 would, quote, degrade to a 2 of 5, such that any 2 keys from the original quorum of 5 would be able to access the funds. And then maybe on an even longer term horizon, maybe 20 or 30 years in the future, if you've had some sort of critical event and you've lost multiple keys, maybe you just need one of the original quorum to be able to move the funds. The challenge with some of those setups is, as I've seen them implemented, they require you to check in with your wallet every once in a while, so that those degradations in the thresholds don't occur. And I don't know whether that's something that people are going to be willing to contend with, or if there are improvements that can mitigate some of that, or how that's going to work out. But I do think that there is merit in this idea of decreasing the threshold for signing over time, such that it makes it even harder to lose your money. And I think some of the things, for all of its challenges, I think there are some innovative things going on with BitKey and these kind of encrypted community backups of private keys. I think it obscures it with complexity that may make some people uncomfortable with it. But in terms of normies, there are some. It's, as I understand what they're doing, it's basically the same thing as you taking a private key over to your friend's house and saying, "Hey, would you keep this in your gun safe for me, and I'll come back if I ever need it." That's just happening in a more sophisticated way online. There are some caveats with that, but I think that's intriguing. We'll see how that plays out. But yeah, those are the developments I see happening, and it's also just this ongoing, never-ending cat and mouse game. Like Rodolfo Novak with CoinKite himself says that every 2 years you should consider upgrading your Coldcard, because that is the nature of the cat and mouse game between people that seek to exploit secure systems and those that seek to prevent people from exploiting secure systems. It's just the nature of the game. So we're going to see some big leaps, and we're going to see just some more incremental innovation and iteration as time goes on.
How about SeedSigner specifically? Is there anything that new features that might be built out in the software soon, or how are you thinking about that?
So we have, we're an entirely volunteer project, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier on, but everything we do is basically given away to fellow Bitcoiners. All of the parts that you need to buy to build a SeedSigner, those are no secret. They're available on our website. They're available in our GitHub repo. The software is, of course, freely available, and you can either download a prepared image that we've released, or you can pretty simply build it from source libraries yourself. And even people who have seen SeedSigners have seen the enclosures that we use to keep these electronic components together. Even the design for those are all open source. So we're all volunteers, and we're giving things away for free. Where we are at in SeedSigner's life cycle is that I would say we have reached a kind of feature richness that has diminished some of the urgency among our developers to get new features out. We've had some big upgrades over time that include getting the device to boot in less than 15 seconds, being able to remove the memory card, being able to produce reproducible builds, which is an important security assurance, supporting different script types. There's been a lot of features that have been added, and we have this feature completeness that makes it a very useful Bitcoin tool for 95, 96% of people who are doing cold storage. But there is still room for growth. There's always ways to improve our user interface. We're looking closely at adding multi-language support, but we're thinking carefully about how we do that so that people from all over the world, because there's people building and sharing SeedSigner on 4 or 5 continents at this point. So we'd love for people to be able to use SeedSigner in their own native language. One of our contributors is working on some updates that would make SeedSigner easier to use with an Unchained Vault that we're looking forward to getting out there, hopefully sometime in the next couple of months. So there are still definitely things we can do to improve the user experience and improve the assurances around the device. But we're all volunteers with a lot of us with families and jobs and lives. So we have a slower release cadence than a lot of people might be used to with commercial wallets. So there's more fun stuff coming, but you just have to wait for the good stuff, I guess.
Yep, that's definitely understandable. Last question, then we can probably go ahead and wrap this up. A lot of people, I think, when it comes to multisig, they think it's complicated, especially if they're new to Bitcoin. What has been your experience seeing people interact with multisig, especially when using a SeedSigner?
The workflows that we use with SeedSigner, I think, presents not just multisig, but the larger concept of creating private keys, setting up wallets with the public version of those private keys, adding signatures to transactions. The workflows that we've implemented in SeedSigner present those, I think, in a way that makes them more intuitive to users. And that's really the big leap. I think with multisig, it's in a way just realizing you need to go through that signing process or that key creation process multiple times. There's a little bit of additional work when you're setting up the wallet and signing that goes along with it. But I don't think it's a leap that is one that a lot of people should be anxious about or that they can't make. There's a lot that is made in the socials about the information keeping requirement around multisig. To boil that down, it's that once you have this multi-signature wallet, you have a configuration that includes all of the public keys that correlate with each of the private keys in the setup. And anytime you want to make a spend, you have to have all of those public keys available. But all of the coordinators present you with various ways of preserving these private keys and configuration in a convenient way, whether it's a binary file that you could store on your computer in the cloud, or even printing it out as a PDF form. You can even store it in your password vault. That not to get too technical, but that multisig descriptor is private but not secret information. So it's not quite at the threshold of your private keys in terms of what you have to do to protect it, because if someone gets access to it, they can just see the contents of your wallet and the activities of you spending from it, but they can't actually access any of your money. So there's a little bit of a learning curve around multisig, but the best way to get over that is just by doing it. So SeedSigner, I describe to some people as the gateway drug to multisig because it dramatically reduces the friction and cost associated with just barely setting up your first multisig. Because you can create as many private keys as you want with that device, and you can use that one device to set up an entire multisig quorum. Once you have that device in your hands, you don't have any excuses. You can get something set up on testnet to where you have no financial loss at stake in terms of setting up the wallet and learning how to make transactions and learning what information you need to safeguard to be able to recover the wallet. Or you can set up an on-chain wallet and put just a little bit of money, put $5 or $10 in it. You lose that money, consider it an investment in your education. But with that one device, you can start getting into the workflows and understanding what a multi-sig transaction looks like to get a sense of, is this something I can be comfortable with? Is this something that makes sense for the amount of Bitcoin that I'm holding? Is this something that I'm comfortable sharing and teaching the people that I care about who are going to be recovering my funds if something happens to me? Is this something I'm comfortable explaining to them? For most people, I think that ends up being a yes, because the advantage of multi-sig far, in my opinion, outweigh any sort of additional complexity or additional record keeping requirements. But I think SeedSigner is really uniquely positioned to get people's foot in the door and let them see and experience multi-sig to decide if it's something that matches their needs.
I like it. Well, thanks for taking the time to sit down with us here. Is there anywhere you'd like to send the audience to learn more about you and what you guys are building at SeedSigner?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and talk with you today. Really, the biggies are just seedsigner.com. It's our marquee website where you can find how-to videos. Obviously, there's high-level information. You can get a link to our Telegram community where we have a bunch of very active, enthusiastic users and some great dialogue around security best practices, how to build a SeedSigner, how to use one. And then on the socials, like most people, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Nostr. You can easily find me there at SeedSigner, all together as one word.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. This was great.
Appreciate it.